There's a particular kind of confusion that many men experience in relationships, and it rarely gets talked about honestly. It's not about technique or confidence or attraction. It's about something more fundamental: the assumption that desire works the same way for everyone. Most men grow up with a straightforward internal model. Interest leads to desire. Desire leads to action. Action leads to outcome. It's clean, linear, predictable. When you want something, you feel it clearly. When you're attracted to someone, your body tells you immediately. The signal is strong and unambiguous. This model isn't wrong, it's just incomplete. The confusion starts when this personal experience becomes the assumed universal, when the way desire works for you becomes the template you use to understand how it works for someone else. And when that template doesn't match reality, when your partner's desire doesn't follow the pattern you expect, it creates a gap that gets filled with interpretation, usually the wrong kind. You might interpret her lack of spontaneous desire as lack of attraction. You might read her need for context and build-up as disinterest. You might see her responsive pattern as manipulation or withholding. None of these interpretations are typically accurate, but they feel true because they're based on translating her experience through your own framework. This isn't about intelligence or empathy. Smart, caring men struggle with this constantly. It's about having only one map for territory that requires two different ones. The cultural scripts don't help. Most of what we see in media, hear in conversations, or absorb growing up suggests that desire is desire. It just happens to everyone the same way. Men want sex more, women want it less, but the mechanism is identical. In this story, if she's not showing obvious enthusiasm, something is wrong, either with her, with you, or with the relationship. This narrative creates a specific kind of pain. When your partner doesn't initiate, you feel rejected. When she needs time to warm up, you feel inadequate. When her desire seems inconsistent or context-dependent, you feel confused and eventually hurt. Because in the model you're working with, these patterns don't make sense unless something is broken. But here's what changes everything. The model itself is the problem, not the relationship. L'accords, two different systems. Let's start with what researchers actually know about desire patterns, because the science here is remarkably clear, even though it's not widely known outside academic circles. There are two main patterns of sexual desire, and while neither is exclusive to one gender, they do map onto gendered experiences more often than not. Understanding this difference isn't about creating new stereotypes. It's about recognizing that your direct experience might not be the only valid one. The first pattern is spontaneous desire. This is what most men experience most of the time. It emerges from nowhere or from minimal stimulus. You see something attractive, you have a passing thought, or you simply wake up wanting sex. The desire comes first before any particular context or interaction. It feels like hunger, a drive that emerges from inside and seeks satisfaction. The second pattern is responsive desire. This is what many women experience most of the time, though it's not universal and it's not absolute. Responsive desire doesn't emerge spontaneously. It develops in response to the right context, the right stimulation, the right emotional and physical cues. It's not that the desire isn't real or strong, it's that it comes after engagement begins, not before. This distinction is crucial because it means that for many women, desire isn't a prerequisite for intimacy. It's an outcome of it. Read that again, because it contradicts almost everything the culture teaches us about how sex is supposed to work. In the spontaneous model, you want first, then you act. In the responsive model, you engage first, then you want. Neither is better or worse. Neither indicates more or less attraction. They're simply different sequences, different ways the system activates. But if you only understand desire through the spontaneous lens, responsive desire looks like something else entirely. It looks like indifference. It looks like duty. It looks like going along with something she doesn't actually want. And this interpretation, while understandable, causes enormous damage. Here's why. When you interpret her responsive pattern as lack of genuine desire, you often pull back. You stop initiating because you don't want to pressure her. You wait for her to show enthusiasm first, to prove she really wants you. This feels respectful, and in some contexts, it is. But if her desire is responsive, your withdrawal removes the very conditions under which her desire emerges. You're waiting for spontaneous desire from someone whose desire is responsive. It's like waiting for a plant to grow without water and wondering why nothing happens. She, meanwhile, notices your withdrawal and interprets it through her own lens. She might think you're not interested anymore. She might feel the pressure of needing to manufacture spontaneous desire she doesn't naturally feel. She might sense your hurt or disappointment and feel guilty, which creates stress, which further suppresses desire. You're both acting with good intentions, both trying to be respectful and responsive, and the system breaks down anyway because you're operating from incompatible models. To be aware, what actually influences desire? If desire for many women is responsive rather than spontaneous, the natural question becomes, responsive to what? This is where men often expect to hear about technique, romance, or physical attributes. And while those things aren't irrelevant, they're not the foundation. The foundation is more subtle and more important. The primary factor is emotional safety. Not safety from physical harm, that's baseline, but safety from judgment, from pressure, from the need to perform or manage someone else's emotions. It's the feeling that your authentic response, whatever it is, will be okay. That saying no won't create a crisis. That saying yes isn't required to maintain peace or prove something. This kind of safety is invisible when it's present and crushingly obvious when it's not. It can't be negotiated or proven with words. It's demonstrated through consistent behavior over time, through how you respond when she's not interested, through whether you sulk, withdraw, or pressure subtly. Through whether her no means the end of the conversation or the beginning of your campaign to change her mind. When emotional safety is present, there's room for desire to develop naturally. When it's absent, desire gets replaced by management. She's managing your disappointment, your ego, your potential reaction. And management is the opposite of desire. You can't want something freely when you're busy calculating the cost of not wanting it. The second factor is context. Desire doesn't exist in a vacuum. It emerges from particular conditions, and those conditions are more complex for most women than most men realize. Context includes practical things: privacy, time, freedom from interruption, physical comfort. But it also includes psychological things: feeling connected, feeling appreciated, feeling like you're seen as a person rather than a means to an outcome. It includes the absence of recent conflict, the presence of mutual respect, the feeling that sex is something you're experiencing together rather than something being done to her or extracted from her. Men often underestimate how much these contextual factors matter because in the spontaneous desire model, they don't matter as much. You can want sex even when you're stressed, even after an argument, even when the conditions aren't ideal. Your desire is more robust to adverse circumstances. But that robustness isn't universal, and assuming it is sets up constant frustration. The third factor, related to both of the above, is the absence of pressure. And this is where things get particularly tricky because pressure is often invisible to the person creating it. Overt pressure is easy to identify and avoid. Explicit demands, guilt trips, coercion. Most men know these are wrong and work to avoid them. But there's a subtler form of pressure that's much harder to see: expectation pressure. This is the pressure that comes from knowing someone wants something from you and is tracking whether you provide it. It's in the hopeful look, the extra attention, the sense that your response is being measured. It's in the pattern of initiating, followed by visible disappointment when the answer is no. It's in the feeling that your desire is always being evaluated, assessed, worried about. This kind of pressure doesn't come from malice. It comes from caring. You want connection, you want to be desired, you want the relationship to be healthy. So you pay attention to her desire, and your attention creates weight. She feels that weight, and the weight itself becomes an obstacle. Here's the paradox. The more you need her to want you, for your ego, for reassurance, for proof of the relationship's health, the harder it becomes for her to want you freely. Because desire requires freedom. It can't be summoned on demand or produced to satisfy someone else's need for validation. The more she senses that her desire matters to your emotional stability, the more her response becomes about managing you rather than experiencing herself. The neuroscience simplified. Understanding why these factors matter so much requires looking briefly at how arousal and desire actually work in the brain, particularly for women. There's a common assumption that arousal is simple. You see something attractive, your body responds, you feel desire. Linear cause and effect. But the research shows something more complex, particularly for women. Women's arousal involves a dual control system. There's an accelerator, the things that turn desire on, but there's also a brake system that's highly sensitive to threat, stress, and negative context. For desire to emerge, it's not enough for the accelerator to be pressed. The brake has to be released. This brake system is particularly sensitive to perceived threat, and threat doesn't just mean physical danger. It includes emotional threat, social threat, the threat of judgment or rejection or being seen as too much or not enough. It includes stress from work, from responsibilities, from mental load. All of these factors press the brake, sometimes lightly, sometimes hard. Here's what makes this crucial. You can be doing everything right with the accelerator. Attraction is present, physical touch feels good, the context is objectively fine, and still, if the brake is engaged, desire won't emerge. And from the outside, this looks inexplicable. It looks like she's not interested or not trying or not attracted. But actually, her system is just responding to signals you might not even be aware exist. There's another fascinating aspect of women's arousal that creates confusion: the gap between physical arousal and subjective desire. Research shows that women's bodies often respond to sexual stimuli. Blood flow increases, physical signs of arousal appear, even when they don't feel desire or interest. This is called arousal non-concordance, and it's much more common in women than men. For men, physical arousal and subjective desire usually match up closely. When your body responds, you feel turned on. The two systems are concordant, but for many women, the body can respond while the mind remains uninterested, or the mind can be interested while the body lags behind. This isn't dysfunction, it's just how the system works. This matters because it means you can't always read her desire from physical signs alone. She might show signs of arousal and still not want to continue, or she might want to continue but need time for her body to catch up. Neither pattern means something is wrong. They're both normal variations in how arousal and desire connect. The implication is significant. Desire for many women is less about a singular physical urge and more about a complex decision made by the brain based on multiple inputs. Is this safe? Is this the right time? Is this the right person? Do I have the space for this? Is the likely outcome worth the energy expenditure? The brain is running a sophisticated calculation, and if too many factors come back negative, the brake stays on regardless of what the accelerator is doing. Why absence doesn't mean failure. One of the most painful misunderstandings men experience is interpreting low or absent desire as evidence of relationship failure or personal inadequacy. This interpretation is understandable, but usually inaccurate. Desire fluctuates. This is true for everyone, but it's especially pronounced in responsive desire patterns. Stress suppresses desire. Exhaustion suppresses desire. Major life changes, new jobs, moving, having children, dealing with family issues, suppress desire. Hormonal changes suppress desire. Medication can suppress desire. Depression and anxiety suppress desire. None of these factors mean the attraction is gone or the relationship is failing. They mean the conditions for desire aren't currently present. This is a crucial distinction because it changes what the absence of desire signifies. In long-term relationships, there's another dynamic at play that many men find disturbing, but is actually predictable. The transformation from new relationship energy to long-term attachment changes the flavor of desire. Early in a relationship, novelty itself is arousing. Uncertainty, discovery, the thrill of newness. These all activate reward centers in the brain powerfully. This phase creates a kind of spontaneous desire that's intense and frequent. Many women experience more spontaneous desire during this phase than they typically do, and men often mistakenly conclude that this temporary heightened state is the baseline they should expect permanently. But novelty fades. This isn't failure, it's biology. Long-term attachment activates different neural pathways. They're no less real or valuable, but they feel different. They're calmer, deeper, less urgent. The desire that emerges from this phase is often more responsive, more contextual, more dependent on active cultivation. Many men experience this shift as loss and interpret it personally. She used to want me more, therefore I'm less attractive to her now. But the shift usually isn't about you. It's about the natural progression from novelty to familiarity. And familiarity doesn't preclude desire. It just changes what desire requires. This is why effort matters, but not the kind of effort most men think. It's not about grand gestures or trying harder to be attractive or initiating more frequently. It's about creating the conditions where responsive desire can emerge. Maintaining emotional connection, reducing stress where possible, protecting time and space for intimacy, keeping the brake system as quiet as possible. What stops? Working. When men discover their partner's desire isn't matching their expectations, there are common reactions that, while understandable, tend to make things worse. The first is treating desire like a problem to solve through effort. You try harder. You're more attentive, more romantic, more complimentary. You work out more, dress better, plan more elaborate dates. The logic seems sound. If desire is low, increase the inputs that should generate it. But this approach often backfires because it increases pressure. Your increased effort signals that this matters intensely to you, which makes her responses carry more weight, which engages the brake system. Also, effort focused on generating a specific outcome isn't usually experienced as generosity. It's experienced as transaction. You're being attentive because you want something, and that wanting is palpable, and it changes the quality of the interaction. The second unhelpful reaction is withdrawing to avoid pressure. You stop initiating because you don't want to be pushy. You wait for her to come to you, hoping that removing pressure will allow her desire to emerge naturally. Sometimes this works, but often it creates a different problem. If her desire is responsive, your withdrawal removes the catalyst. Additionally, your withdrawal might communicate disinterest or hurt, which creates emotional distance, which further suppresses desire. You're trying to be respectful, but the message received is abandonment or passive aggression. The third pattern is treating sex as the primary measure of relationship health. When desire is low, you interpret the entire relationship as failing. This creates an atmosphere of crisis around something that might be a natural fluctuation or a solvable contextual issue. The crisis itself becomes another stressor, another brake on desire. What all these reactions have in common is that they're responses to the wrong problem. They're trying to fix broken desire when usually desire isn't broken. It's just responsive to conditions that aren't currently optimal. Dringler. What actually helps? If the common reactions don't work, what does? The foundation is separating her desire from your worth. This is harder than it sounds because desire feels personal. When someone wants you, it feels like validation. When they don't, it feels like rejection. But making your self-worth dependent on her desire puts enormous pressure on her desire to perform a function it's not designed for. Her desire is about her state, her context, her system. It's not a report card on your value. When you can internalize this, genuinely and not just intellectually, it removes a huge source of pressure from the dynamic. She can have low desire, and it doesn't mean you're failing. It just means her desire is low, which is information to work with rather than a verdict to internalize. The second shift is understanding that creating space is more effective than creating pressure. Space means security that her response, whatever it is okay. It means absence of tracking, of hopeful expectation, of subtle disappointment. It means sex can be offered and declined without weight. This doesn't mean never initiating. It means initiating from genuine desire to connect rather than need for validation. It means receiving no without making it a referendum on the relationship. It means sometimes initiating knowing the answer might be no and being genuinely okay with that. The third element is recognizing that intimacy and sex aren't synonyms. Men often use sex as the primary vehicle for emotional connection, while women often need emotional connection as the foundation for sex. Neither approach is wrong, but they can create a gridlock. You seek sex to feel close. She needs closeness to want sex. Breaking this pattern requires finding other ways to create closeness that don't have sex as the implied goal. Physical affection that isn't foreplay. Conversation that isn't building toward anything. Presence that's about actually being together rather than engineering an outcome. These interactions reduce the brake system's sensitivity by proving that intimacy is safe and not always transactional. Fourth, paying attention to her actual context matters more than trying to create ideal conditions. You can't always remove stress or solve problems, but you can acknowledge them. You can ask what would actually help rather than assuming you know. You can take things off her plate when possible, not as a strategy to generate desire, but as genuine partnership. This might sound indirect, like it's avoiding the actual issue, but remember, for responsive desire, context is the issue. The specific stressor might be outside your control, but your response to her being stressed isn't. Being someone who reduces load rather than adds to it shifts the overall conditions in which desire might emerge. Fifth, sometimes the most helpful thing is direct conversation stripped of agenda. Not, we need to talk about our sex life, in a tone that implies crisis, but genuine curiosity about her experience. What does desire feel like for her? What helps and what doesn't? What creates pressure and what creates space? These conversations are difficult because they feel vulnerable and because you might hear things that are hard to receive, but they're worth having because they replace guesswork with information. You might discover her responsive pattern, or learn about specific contextual factors you weren't aware of, or find out that something you thought was helpful is actually adding pressure. The key is approaching these conversations as genuine inquiry rather than veiled complaint. The goal isn't to fix her or prove she's wrong. It's to understand how her system actually works so you can work with it rather than against it. Desire, and self-worth. There's a particular vulnerability men carry about desire that rarely gets acknowledged openly. When your partner doesn't want you sexually, it feels like a fundamental judgment on your worth as a man. This isn't shallow or stupid. It's a deeply embedded cultural message that male value is tied to being desired. This connection between desire and worth is destructive for everyone involved. For you, it makes every instance of low desire feel like rejection and failure. Your self-esteem becomes dependent on something you can't control and shouldn't need to control. For her, it makes her desire carry far too much weight. It's no longer just about what she wants. It's about managing your emotional stability. Disconnecting these is essential and difficult. It requires examining where you learned that being desired equals having value. It requires building self-worth from sources that aren't dependent on someone else's variable state. It requires accepting that you can be attractive, valuable, worthy of love, and still have a partner whose desire is low because of factors that have nothing to do with you. This isn't about lowering standards or accepting situations that aren't working. It's about having a more accurate understanding of what low desire means. Sometimes it means the relationship isn't right or needs work, but more often it means desire is responsive to context, and that context currently isn't optimal. When you stop taking desire personally, something interesting happens. The pressure lifts. The dynamic becomes lighter. There's room for honest conversation because her response isn't crushing your sense of self. And paradoxically, this often creates better conditions for desire to emerge. The brake system relaxes when it's not being monitored and evaluated constantly. Different maps, same territory. The core insight that changes everything is simple but profound. Female desire often works differently than male desire, and different doesn't mean defective. Responsive desire isn't lesser than spontaneous desire. It's not broken desire waiting to be fixed. It's not evidence of low attraction or relationship problems. It's simply a different activation pattern, one that's sensitive to context and dependent on conditions that might not matter much in your own experience. Understanding this doesn't mean you have to like it. You might prefer a partner with spontaneous desire who initiates frequently and wants sex in any context. That's a valid preference. But if you're with someone whose desire is responsive, trying to force it into the spontaneous pattern creates suffering for both of you. The question becomes, can you work with responsive desire rather than against it? Can you create conditions that work for her system rather than expecting her system to match yours? Can you separate her variable desire from your fixed worth? These aren't questions about settling or compromising your needs. They're questions about whether you're willing to understand and work with reality as it is, rather than as you expected it to be. Many men find that once they understand responsive desire, the confusion and hurt diminish, not because the situation changes immediately, but because it makes sense now. The pattern that felt like rejection or manipulation or proof of problems turns out to be a predictable response to identifiable conditions. This knowledge is practical, not just theoretical. When you know desire is responsive, you stop waiting for spontaneous initiation and start creating the conditions that allow responsiveness. When you know the brake system exists, you pay attention to stress and pressure rather than just focusing on attraction. When you know arousal and desire can be discordant, you don't over-interpret physical responses. The men who struggle most with female desire are often the ones who care most about getting it right. They want their partners to be happy. They want connection. They want to be good lovers. But they're working with an incomplete map, and so their effort goes in directions that don't help or actively backfire. The men who struggle least aren't necessarily more skilled or attractive. They just understand the territory better. They know desire is contextual, that absence isn't judgment, that responsive patterns are valid. This understanding doesn't solve every problem, but it prevents a lot of unnecessary pain. View her first and the longer view. Relationships change over time, and the desire within them changes too. This is normal and expected, not evidence of decay. The intensity of early desire isn't sustainable, and it's not supposed to be. What replaces it can be deeper and more sustainable, but only if you understand what you're building toward. Long-term desire requires maintenance, but maintenance of conditions rather than constant effort to generate a specific outcome. It requires protecting connection, managing stress, maintaining emotional safety, creating space. These aren't sexy interventions. They're not the stuff of romance novels or grand gestures, but they're what actually works with responsive desire over time. Men often feel frustrated by this because it seems unfair. Why should desire require so much maintenance? Why can't it just exist naturally like it does for you? But this is like asking why a garden needs tending when wild plants grow fine on their own. Different systems have different requirements. Responsive desire requires cultivation. That's not a flaw. It's just how it works. The alternative to understanding this is perpetual frustration. You can keep expecting spontaneous desire and feeling hurt when it doesn't appear. You can keep interpreting responsive patterns as rejection. You can keep making your worth dependent on her variable state. But this path leads to resentment, distance, and eventual breakdown. Or you can learn the actual system you're working with. You can release expectations based on your own experience and develop new ones based on hers. You can stop taking fluctuations personally and start addressing conditions. You can separate desire from worth and intimacy from validation. This path doesn't guarantee constant desire or solve every problem, but it does reduce the unnecessary suffering that comes from fighting reality, and it creates space for desire to exist on its own terms rather than being strangled by expectation and pressure. The goal isn't to become an expert in female desire or to master some technique that unlocks reliable enthusiasm. The goal is simpler and more important: to understand that desire works differently for different people, that these differences don't indicate problems, and that working with someone's actual system is more effective than trying to change it into something it's not. This understanding is a gift to both people in the relationship. For you, it reduces confusion, hurt, and the burden of feeling responsible for something you can't control. For her, it reduces pressure, guilt, and the sense that her natural pattern is somehow wrong. Better relationships aren't built on perfect desire or constant enthusiasm. They're built on understanding, flexibility, and working with reality rather than fighting it. When you stop expecting desire to be simple and linear, when you understand that low desire doesn't equal low love, when you can create space instead of pressure, that's when things actually improve. Not because you've fixed her or mastered some strategy, but because you've stopped trying to force the wrong map onto the right territory. And with the correct map, the territory makes sense. It's not easier, necessarily, but it's navigable. And navigable is enough.